Second TrAIN open lecture this academic year. I'd like to present to you a great honour to have with us Professor Jonathon Harris. For many years he was the Director of Research at Liverpool.
The Centre for Architecture and Visual Art.
Yes, where I happen to do my MA. And working with, in collaboration with institutions such as Tate in Liverpool and so on. But recently he's moved and he's now Director of Research at Winchester School of Art, Director of the new Research Centre, Winchester Centre for Global Futures in Art, Design and Media. And today he'll be speaking about globalization and revolution.
I hope so.
And so I'll leave you with Jonathon. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's quite hot in here, isn't it? I think I might take my jacket. Consider two artifacts, two artworks, illustrated here by two photographs. The first shows a large object placed in the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern in London in 2009, viewed and entered by many tens of thousands of people. The second shows a model from 1919, made a year or so after the Russian Revolution, for a planned enormous tower in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, which, given the then available technology, could not have been built. These two constructions, Miroslav Balka's How It Is, the 10th contribution to the Unilever series of large artworks installed in the hall since 2000, and Vladimir Tatlin's model for a monument to the Third International, stand, I shall argue, at either ends of an intelligible, poignant history, what I will call Utopian Globalism in modern art, culture and society. This is my term for an idea of worldwide social transformation to be brought about within a modernity recognised to be global in its nature and effects. It is an idea that was given visual form and material substance by artists committed to a vision of the world beyond the limits and values of tyrannical government, capitalist social order, and acquisitive materialism. Notions of globalization and modernism are by now reasonably familiar, whilst the term globalism is perhaps less so. Tatlin's model for a soaring structure symbolizing the communist ideal certainly was the first ambitious contribution to 20th century revolutionary modernist internationalism, a tradition of visionary thinking and making that was avowedly utopian, gripped by an optimistic belief in the power of materialized imagination. In contrast, Balka's squat metal container, entered via a shallow-angled ramp and, like Tatlin's proposed tower, part sculpture, part inhabitable architecture, afforded the experience, when I visited it, of a blackening, sinister totality as one proceeded into its interior space, as well as an uncertain, if not wholly disconcerting, physical and social relation extended to the others, also ambulant or motionless within the structure. Tatlin's model, foundation for a memorial to the Third International World Communist Movement, sparked into life by the successful Bolshevik-led uprising in Russia in October 1917, disappeared during the 1920s. And since then, the only surviving visual traces of his imagined tower have been a number of spectral black and white photographs. Given the mythic ethereality of Tatlin's creation, meaningful comparisons with Balka's actual physical box of 2009, big perhaps in relation to many contemporary artworks, but tiny compared to Tatlin's giant structure, which it was proposed would straddle the river Neva in Petrograd, perhaps seem far-fetched, even unfair. Nevertheless, I shall claim that How It Is represents a recent significant addition, as well as a kind of historical conclusion to the utopian globalist lineage. Balka's structure does so in the sense that, Along with other works in the Unilever series, it represents an attempt by the selected artists to demonstrate that contemporary art can still compellingly figure, that is, give visual and material form to, a politically and aesthetically radical critique of the world's social order in the first decade of the 21st century. Other examples of late utopian globalism, what is now its multinational corporate patronal phase, because the projects are sponsored by Unilever, include Allison's The Weather Project, a yellow glowing disc of light hung at one end of the turbine hall in 2003-04. Doris Salcedo's 2007-8 Shibboleth, an incision cut into the stone ground of the length of part of the hall, creating an earthquake-like microchasm that has been left to scar the gallery's floor. Both appear to allude to the potential human-made environmental and socio-political catastrophes now facing the Earth, its peoples, and all of life on the planet. Within my account of utopian globalist art of the last 90 years, spanning Tatlin's Tower to the Turbine Hall's programmatically spectacular array of distracting visions and enigmatic objects, it will become clear that claims relating to modern and contemporary art's socio-critical purpose have interlocked with its utopic visionary function in a variety of ways across the era. The development of these modes and practices has, in addition, become seemingly inevitably more closely bound up with technologically dynamic mass media forms of representation and dissemination. For in this lineage, photography, film, television, video, mixed media installation, and now internet communication technologies have become, certainly along with persisting practices of drawing, painting, and sculpture, constitutive of globalized contemporary art, as well as significant facets of utopian globalist aspiration for transformative social change. Such extending and adaptive processes were active within the early 20th century modern, as well as within our own postmodern and contemporary conjunctures. These are the times, spaces, means, and forms that link Tatlin's Tower and Bulker's box. Doubtless many works made between 1919 and 2011 might find a place in this lineage. Today, however, I can only consider one in some detail. Its art status is questionable, but in a way, all the works constituting the utopian globalist lineage have pressured and pushed beyond received categories, principles, practices, and values. From two, make one. From the chair to the bed. Make love, not war. The Montreal Bed-In, the Bed-In for Peace, whatever we decide to call this event, an event never offered as an artwork, therefore given no official title by its creators, and subsequently never curated or definitively pigeonholed by an owning institution such as an art museum or gallery, took place in the last week of May in 1969 at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in downtown Montreal, in Suite 1742. John and Yoko's own descriptions and explanations of the event during the event were part of the event. Quote, "Holding a bed-in is our way," John said in conversation with Charles Childs, countercultural art critic, interviewing the pair in bed for a planned Life magazine piece. Quote, "Holding a bed-in is our way of using today's methods. It's a form of publicity," unquote. Looking back at Bed-In from 2011, a few months after John Lennon would have been 70, and a few months after Bed-In itself turned 41, the event might seem relatively unremarkable to those, say, in their 20s now, which I imagine a lot of you out there are. Reality TV and the celebrity-obsessed mass media have been around, we know, for many years now. Bed-In was certainly an early moment in the linked genealogy of this culture, an early moment in the history of pop and rock stars making music and raising money for a social cause. At the end of the Bed-In week, John and Yoko, along with those in the suite, sang and recorded Give Peace a Chance. This live recording, subsequently edited and improved in a proper studio, was released quickly and became a big hit in the US, Britain, and elsewhere. The money rolled in for Capitol Records, for John and Yoko, and obscurely for the cause of peace, though it isn't clear where all the money actually went. Peace meant both a lot and little in May 1969. The hoped for and agitated end of the war in Vietnam, which would come in 1975, a domestic settlement amounting to a revolution in the USA around equal rights for blacks, oppressed women, gay people, criminals, drug users, children, even animals, the end of British colonialism in Ireland, a projected world of non-violence where much of the anticipated positive content remained impenetrably vague, a blank, banal wish list to be filled in, utopian socialism, a nirvana of spiritual and physical lovemaking, the end of psychobiological trauma, and all division from nature, the mother and God. All and nothing, then. The bed-in, John and Yoko's bed-in for peace, unified these disparate aims and ideals through the couple's own jointly embodied personification of love, happiness, and concord, enacted in their occupation of the bed-in suite 1742. This, I would say, was what John and Yoko intended the event to mean, insofar as they ever had clear intentions or retrospectively formulated an account of these in the discussions at bed-in that they had with journalists such as Childs. As historians, however, we have to try to place bed-in within a broader understanding in order to make productive sense of it. For us, for our now. It's still surprising, I think, that the event has figured so relatively insignificantly in cultural and art historical accounts of the later 1960s, though perhaps understandable too. This has been partly because bed-in hasn't signified clearly enough in the discipline, for instance, of art history, because of ambiguities relating to its nature as an event, lying somewhere obscurely in between, on the one hand, the avant-garde world of happenings, mixed media, and what would later come to be called installation, and on the other, the mass media worlds of pop, political pop, and counterculture new left social activism. Though bed-in certainly generated its own dynamic and sometimes chaotic flows of action, statements, interactions between those in the suite and related to those outside agencies. John and Yoko were often on the telephone talking to demonstrators around the US and elsewhere. An important part of the responsibility for the relative invisibility of bed-in historical terms lies with the inability or unwillingness of scholars to attempt to deal with the event's seemingly perverse, opaque, phenomenal contours. But these aren't and weren't simply the walls of Suite 1742 or the dimensions of the king-size bed John and Yoko spent the day lying in, orchestrating their event. These expanding contours actually comprise the permeable, interacting borders linking the physical, spatial character of bed-in and the actions therein of its protagonists to the broad organisational and social forces, economic, political and ideological, of the then globalising music and TV industries, consumer capitalism, the US federal state and its security agencies, the new left counterculture, as well as the institutionalised disciplines, pedagogies and discourses of art, art criticism, art and cultural history. In making sense of bed-in, presuppositions of clear divisions between the inside and outside of the event, of the work and meaning of bed-in relative to its claimed contexts, will have to be revised radically. What I offer here then is the outline, only an outline, of how these contours might be identified, analysed and made sense of by us, and for our now. 2 years before bed-in, Guy Debord published his Society of the Spectacle, a text John and Yoko could have used as a kind of manual for Montreal. Debord predicts what bed-in was to serve up. Quote, "As specialists of apparent life," Debord noted, "stars serve as superficial objects that people can identify with in order to compensate for the fragmented productive specializations that they actually live." The function of these celebrities is to act out various lifestyles or socio-political viewpoints in a full, totally free manner. They embody the inaccessible results of social labour by dramatising the byproducts of that labour which are marginally projected above it as its ultimate goals. Power and vacations, unquote. Very recently married in Gibraltar, the Montreal bed-in followed hard on the heels of a series of honeymoon, vacation, peace events which John and Yoko undertook in collaboration with the world's media and various national and international security agencies habitually monitoring their progress around the globe. By 1969, it seemed that John and Yoko thought it natural to play out or perform their relationship in public, and appeared to believe that virtually all the detail and dramas of their life together exemplified situations, dilemmas and possibilities that all people experienced and could benefit from. In their songs, TV, radio, magazine interviews, Yoko's art exhibitions, John's books and film parts, and much else. The Montreal bed-in was an extension, a kind of higher synthesis of a range of these mediated self-representations of John and Yoko, a Gesamtkunstwerk, if you will, the total work of art. This term, Gesamtkunstwerk, translates usually as a universal artwork or as a synthesis of the arts or a total work of art. It's fitting given that John and Yoko's different but closely aligned use of words and music during the 1960s, in, for example, song lyrics, conceptual poetry, singing, spoken script, and impromptu statement and and sound production, both separately and together, later in film and diverse public performances, that the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk is most famously associated with the music and operatic theatre of Wagner, an ideal totalizing of form and meaning constituting an orchestrated structure of performative actions teetering on or over the edge of coherence and order. Bed-in, however, was not in any sense intelligibly or carefully scripted or composed prior to its occurrence. Something actually also true of many 1960s avant-garde art world happenings and actions, though many others were scripted and prepared meticulously in advance. Suggestive, rather than both of the ambitions of Bed-in and its imminent capacity for or will to disorder, Gesamtkunstwerk captures something of the unbreathable, precarious idealism and delusions of its creators at the time, and of the world that helped to create their belief that Bed-in in late May 1969 was a good and a necessary thing to do. At the same time, however, John, it's less obvious in statements made at the time or later by Yoko, demonstrated a knowing realism of the limitations and absurdities of their posture. Quote, Laurel and Hardy, that's John and Yoko, John said. Quote, we stand a better chance under that guise because all serious people like Martin Luther and Kennedy and Gandhi got shot. Unquote. Bed-in then was to be entertainment, if it was also to be a form of political protest. The conjoining of the two and the presentation of them within the mediations of television, radio, and other institutionalized communication technologies defined the moment and the means. The media was interested in the first place only because Bed-in's protagonists were stars. John and Yoko's calculation was that they could use the global media as much as it could use them. De Boer once called Marshall McLuhan, the global village theorist, remember, quote, the most convinced imbecile of the 20th century. And in a way, John and Yoko might be seen as two of McLuhan's biggest village idiots, screen jesters who thought mass communication of a serious message was possible, but which had to be transmitted through the medium of television. Denied access to a base in New York and direct US television airtime because of John's drug conviction in England, Montreal offered a close proximity to the power and personalities America's social order represented. Alison Gordon, the Canadian broadcast corporation producer responsible for the televisual presentation of Bed-In, negotiated in advance, recalled the event 40 years later as an experience bathed in what she called a golden glow. This had less to do with the pair's own shimmering personalities, however, or the purity of their objectives, than with the yellow transparent paper they had carefully taped over the windows. This allowed the light to come through warm as honey, she remembered. John and Yoko, Gordon reflected, quote, knew how to dress a set, unquote. If the German artist Joseph Beuys had taken honey, put it on his head in front of the cameras a few years earlier in his action, How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hair, then Bed-In combined Yoko's background in New York Fluxus, neo-avant-garde, happening performance culture with John Lennon's Beatles superstardom. Their partnership, John observed with understatement, brought together what he called two big egos, unquote. Luckily for them and the waiting world, their common goal, he said, was world peace. The war in Vietnam had acted as a focus for both Beuys and John and Yoko by the end of the 1960s. A few years earlier, in August 1966, John Lennon had condemned the US bombing of Hanoi, capital of the North, and a week later all the Beatles had made a similar statement. By 1969, over 500,000 US soldiers ostensibly were fighting the threat of world communism on Asian soil on behalf of the free peoples of the democratic West, including the West Germans living under a constitution designed by the Allies at the end of World War II to prevent forever the return of a dictatorial leader within a country divided into two halves, supposedly organised under antagonistic socio-political systems. De Boer, however, believed that they were in fact interdependent forms of spectacle. If Beuys's actions had begun to figure a form of artistic agitational struggle against this Cold War historical settlement, by 1963 using methods and materials evolved within the mass culture realm of print, photography, film and TV, though combined with nostalgic, idealist elements of earlier 20th century traditions in modern sculpture, and Bed-In, by contrast, constituted a kind of nuclear acceleration of Beuysian utopian rhetorics. John and Yoko's combination of rock singer and avant-garde artist was a concomitant phenomenon of transforming fusion, uniting and extending the roles and significance of global publicity, public relations and media management activities into the contemporary art world and its luxury commodity markets. Nevertheless, a utopian globalist world peace, based on what John and Yoko called the power of love, remained their ostensible aim. The era we enter with Bed-In is recognisably within the utopian globalist genealogy, traceable back to Tatlin and the spiritual spirals inside his ideal communist tower, the planned monument to the Third International from 1919. It finds resonance too in the childish idealism that some believed, or at least claimed, motivated Picasso's own investment in the world communist movement as the necessary vehicle for global redemption immediately after World War II. Though John and Yoko, like Beuys, were always wary of and often hostile to mainstream and oppositional parties and organisations, to the systems of both Western capitalism and Soviet-style state communism. No political party globalism, then, for John and Yoko, but neither Beuys's purism of artistic means towards transformation, although he had wished by the mid-60s to expand those beyond any existing recognisable senses, signifying this aspiration through his famous stipulation, every man is an artist, unquote. But the John and Yoko composite identity, an ideal collective of two, which they called Lenono, which was later the legal name of their musical company, arguably remained too volatile and sporadic to bear meaningful comparison with the long journey and development of Beuys's own image career, which had developed from the 40s to his death in 1986. Yoko had said that Lenono didn't, quote, want to put ourselves in the dangerous position of becoming leaders, unquote, suggesting both that they believed leaders as social types and symptoms of collective life were inherently suspect, and that their own activities as a pair and individually might not, should not, always prove legible or to be taken to offer models for others to emulate. On this score too, at least rhetorically, they were demarcated from Beuys. Yoko's earlier experiments in what later became known art historically as conceptualism, performance, provided her with a background in the practices of what I call gestural radical voluntarism that characterized the locutions of earlier and some contemporary utopian globalists, which did away, again at least rhetorically, with the need for a clear and hierarchical performer-spectator demarcation. Yoko's statement, Collecting Piece 3 from 1962, for instance, appeared to indicate the redundancy of an audience, transferring the power to act and perform to anyone, beyond borders both literal and metaphorical. A bit of poetry now. This is Yoko. Break your mirror and scatter the pieces over different countries. Travel and collect the pieces and glue them back together again. You may use a letter or a diary instead of a mirror. You may break a doll or an airplane 1,000 feet high in the sky over a desert, unquote. These imagining injunctions anyone could carry out or decide not to, or see the impossibility of. On the other hand, the collective imagination of something called world peace was the conceptual rhetorical basis for Bedin, and this event embodied the core public creation and performance of John and Yoko's relationship, the iconographic performative diffusion of their composite avant-garde art rock world identity as Len-Ono, formed about a year earlier after John had visited an exhibition of Yoko's work at a London gallery. Bedin began on Monday, the 26th of May 1969 and lasted until the 1st of June, the following Sunday. The music and TV corporations had a very significant stake in many aspects of this apparently countercultural event. As part of the New Left's culture of resistance to US capitalist imperialism, the utopian globalism of Bedin would partly be bought and sold over the counter. A series of large billboard ads for world peace, posted in cities around the world after Bedin, with radical voluntarist slogans such as "Imagine peace" and "War is over," confirm something of the nature of the hard sell techniques involved with Bedin. John joked that he would bill President Nixon for their cost. Bedin had been conceived and coordinated as a vehicle for spectacular mass media exploitation, to be filmed and broadcast by Canadian National Television, beamed into the US, and with the plan that Life magazine, amongst others, would interview Len-Ono during the week. Child's interview, however, was never published, although parts of it appeared in the soft porn magazine Penthouse in the October 1969 edition, with the inviting title, can you see it there? John and Yoko, Sex is What It's All About. Nice little reference to Prince Charles here as well, which is historically archaic. John and Yoko's Sex is What It's All About. The hook having been presumably the idea that Len-Ono had actually planned to have, or pretended to have, sex in the bed on television. In fact, John and Yoko spent their nights off camera in another room altogether, in a witting or unwitting parodic reproduction of the ordinary work, leisure, sleep regime that de Boer observed celebrity stars only appeared to transcend in what he called their full, totally free lifestyles, devoted to power and vacations. John and Yoko would commute then to Suite 1742 every morning, after the hotel maids had prepared their pristine white sheets for another day in front of the world's cameras. Conducting Bedin in a hotel conformed to de Boer's image of celebrities' lives and followed antecedent, curtailed Bedins at the Amsterdam Hilton and, more briefly still, in Barbados a few days earlier in May. Surviving textual and recorded evidence suggests that the interrogation of the relations between sex and peace as ideas and activities remained mostly unexplored during Bedin, though the former category was elided constantly and functionally with love, one of the key counterculture part synonyms for the principle of non-violence or anti-violence. And in the context of the recent extension of conflict in Vietnam with the Tet Offensive carried out by the Vietnamese Liberation Army against US troops in the spring of 1968, peace perhaps did mean then, rather simply, though its achievement could not be simple, the call for an immediate cessation of the industrial killing taking place in Indochina. At any rate, on every morning of bed-in, Lenono combed reactions to their events in the world newspapers before climbing into their work pyjamas for the attention of the cameras and the dirty job of promoting world peace. Bed-in, as I've said, was not conceived, announced, signalled or packaged as a particular category of event, although at the time and since it was partly assimilated to the then emerging avant-garde art world rubrics of event, happening and action. Whatever the niceties of distinctions between these categories, bed-in clearly was a performance. A term, however, with a range of interacting meanings, including, as well as those related to the nascent art world terms, some of the traditional senses of a theatrical and dramatic presentation, as well as those related to the carrying out of ordinary everyday tasks, either under or away from special scrutiny. The performance of bed-in then was all of these performances, sometimes simultaneously and sometimes sequentially. But although created as and for a mass media event, it was also an event experienced by those who actually visited the room itself and who worked on its organisation and production as an event for others. Ono's years of previous association with the New York Fluxus network of artists, dancers and critics, as well as with other informal groupings in the city, certainly helped to lead to bed-in being interpreted, broadly speaking, as meaningful within a contemporary art world conjuncture of activities and meanings. That is to say, critics, artists and many others recognised the art signals bed-in transmitted. But John's global fame as a member of the Beatles hugely overshadowed Yoko's artistic career as a guide to making sense of bed-in. While it's announced, if vague political purpose sent media interlocutors, others drawn into its orbit and its mass audience, no doubt, down many paths of possible explanation for the nature of the event. What are they doing in the bed? Colossal ambiguities arose here, however. The stated political purpose of bed-in was both apparently immediately practical and distantly utopian. On the one hand, it was an emergency one-off protest against the war in Vietnam. On the other, bed-in was offered as an image narrative of a generalised peace for in-human relation, standing in, or rather lying down, for human society understood as a totality based on the love, sex, peace state embodied within the composite identity of John Lennon and Yoko Ono, which figured this potential global totality of utopian peace in words, music, pictures, and interactions in the physical and social space of the room and beyond. To paraphrase and adapt Theodor Adorno, whose aesthetic theory was published only a few months later in 1970, bed-in offered a utopian dream image of the best possible life, drawing attention to the antagonisms of the world, but in its spirit, aloofly detached from the misery from which this image was wrested. So, imagine, quote, a typical morning, the bed is made. John is already downing his orange juice straight from the jug, while a waiter pours tea. Timothy Leary gazes out of the window. It was the first meeting of these two counterculture gods, unquote. This snippet of retrospective commentary indicates something of the antinomies bed-in encapsulated. The super-rich lifestyle meets gesturally transgressive dissidence activism in front of the world's cameras. Here then are signs of the power Debord observes is magically projected above what he called the inaccessible results of social labour within the spectacle. John and Yoko themselves recursively monitored film of their bed-in as it proceeds, perhaps in the way that Picasso and Dora Maar might have pored over the successive photographs of Guernica the latter took on its progress to completion in 1937. An earlier duo of star-sex activism also performed for the cause of world peace, though under very different circumstances. Like Boyce too, Bedin generates an impromptu devotional shrine based around a collection of art povera, Metz-brow-like objects gathered on the suite's window ledge. You can see there at behind John Lennon's head, and the diminutive bedside table covered with flowers sent to these countercultural gods and bearing a small Buddha statue. This Western counterculture dream of an Eastern spiritual transcendence of Western capitalist imperialism unites Boyce's actions with Lenono, that composite identity also embodying and figuring a utopian synthesis of West-East and art rock Eurasia. Bedin symbolically constituted a counterculture celebrity royalty. On their bed throne, Lenono meet their subjects, Federalist Canadian and separatist Quebecois politicians, pop fans, journalists from around the world, representatives from religious and peace groups, show business world folk, Tommy Smothers, Petula Clark, black comedian Dick Gregory, the crippled and the blind, looking for cures and sympathy. Undifferentiated love-in groups who were not allowed entry mass outside in the corridor in the hotel or in the street, or muster in collective spirit on demonstrations against the war in Vietnam across the states. Give peace a chance, is one source suggests, the last suggestion Yoko makes in a telephone call to demonstrators in Berkeley, California, expecting the National Guard imminently to charge them to the ground. Occasionally, the media tries to throw in an antagonist in order to contrive a different, non-peace, non-love form of spectacle for the cameras. The right-wing cartoonist Al Capp, for instance, intent on insults and attacking counterculture promiscuity, comes in and has an interview. But John and Yoko, the holy people in their matching, flowing dark hair and white pyjamas, fend these provocations off or counter-manipulate. The image created, one observer notes, is that John and Yoko appear to exist within a sequestered zone of peace within the chaos of the room, inside invisible boundaries, demarcating their maintained specialness. Like Boyce, they may yearn to join the masses, or have the masses join them, but they retain a regal autonomy. Their performance is diplomacy of a kind. And like Christo and Jeanne-Claude, for example, Lenono become experts in this necessary game too. Diplomacy is a core part of the utopian aesthetic of large public building wrapping, though the negotiation process is not always foregrounded in the mass media representation and campaigns. The photographs of Christo's protracted negotiation with German officials over the plan to wrap the Reichstag building in Berlin recall Montreal in a variety of ways. Dialogue, or apparent dialogue, along with its socio-physical rituals focused on the bed or the sofa or the dinner table around the laid out plans and models, becomes an important symbol of utopian globalism from the Boyce era onwards. It signals interaction, a creative collaborative rather than antagonistic or atomized collectivity, and is another figure for synthesis and union and the ending of borders. Nicholas Bourriard's relational aesthetic is the kind of bastard child of these early, sometimes fumbling efforts. John agrees to talk, for instance, live on Radio CFOX, the only English-language rock station in Montreal at the time, quote unquote, enabling his message of peace to receive, quote, maximum publicity. Getting into the swing of things, he also decides to introduce records, read out commercials, and expound his characteristic banter. The ordinariness of performance, the performance of ordinariness, is communicated through this low-level talk enacted in between the set-piece interactions and dramatic crisis management phone calls. Witting or not, it contributes to the varied textual signatures and semantics of Bedin, understood as a temporary form of imagined future potential collective human life. And not all utopian times will be high and loud or especially meaningful. Temporality as a socio-political theme begins to emerge in conceptualist art of various kinds during the later 60s, some of it connected to Fluxus activities. It's a significant aspect of Yoko's own earlier works in numerous media, but then erupts across a range of practices and groupings only partially connected to art or to the sociality of the art world. About a year after Bedin, for instance, Douglas Herbler undertakes duration piece number 14 at Bedford, Massachusetts. For 7 consecutive days, at about 6 p.m, the artist has a group of men and women assembled to have their photographs taken in the same or similar positions, wearing the same clothes or carrying the same props in order to suggest the pictures were taken rapidly in one session. Before each photograph was taken, however, cards were flashed in front of the group carrying a collection of words. The subjects were required to think about the words, but not to allow their facial or bodily expressions to in any way suggest the nature of their thoughts. The photographs were displayed, numbered in the order they were taken, along with the words, which included peace, peace, war, and love. This work recalls Boyce's blackboards and diagrams for use in his lectures on the science of freedom and the poster boards upon which Lenin had scrawled the separate words, not lines, of the song Give Peace a Chance, used in the recording in Montreal. So, exploitation and exploration of duration, impromptu elements and serendipitous collectivity characterised these actions, and those of another event also related to Bedin. On Saturday, the 3rd of January 1970, a group of anti-Vietnamese war activists, artists, witnesses, members of the Guerrilla Art Action Group and the Art Workers Coalition entered the Museum of Modern Art in New York and located themselves in front of Picasso's Guernica. At 1 p.m, they laid wreaths of flowers underneath the painting, and Joyce Kozloff, carrying her baby, sat on the floor in front of this makeshift shrine. A Catholic priest read a memorial service for the babies shot by US troops in the 1968 My Lai massacre, an event suppressed by the government and the media, whose copiously photographed records of which were eventually published, large-scale and in full colour, in Life magazine in November 1969. Bedin as an event, an intervention, a performance, a media product, interlocks genealogically, politically, socially and aesthetically with the divergent spectacularities of these two other situations, the former abstracted and benign, the latter directly political and confrontational. At the same time, however, Herbler's duration piece number 14 and Guernica's line at MoMA might be said to have dialectically integrated each other's opposing spectacular characters. The peace, war and love signs flashed at the subjects to be photographed by Herbler were part of a longer list, also including birth, death, monster hate and free choice. The continuity of their presence and appearance in front of the camera presupposed those subjects living the 24 hours between each of the 7 photographs and reproducing themselves over this time in order to appear the same or similar. This depended on the world and its spatio-temporal conditions affording that possibility. The activists settled on the ground in front of Picasso's painting, affording the low camera angles reproducing the shots of dead babies and mothers at My Lai, were also members of families and friends, a group assembled for a set of photographs that they no doubt wished to have taken and disseminated globally, showing their presence and appearance, dependent also on the world and its conditions of existence. So, accounting for Bedin's genealogy involves understanding its own spatio-temporal character within an analytic framework of both sequential and paradigmatic relations. That is to say, its understanding must be what I would call genetic structuralist in kind, making sense of its relation to earlier 1960s phenomena and others more immediately contemporary with it, including events that preceded it. Bedin, as part of a structure of feeling, then, is the way that I would go. I'm not concerned much, that is, with the art historical game of determining antecedents and precedents, or judging instances of supposed originality and derivativeness. Bedin, for instance, I think, has little or no significant thematic relationship to the use of beds, or bed equipment, or as found sculptural materials, or as assisting elements within multimedia works. Bedin did not mobilise objects such as the bed or bedside tables, or those collected within the makeshift shrine, in the way that Boyce did consciously and programmatically take pre-existing found objects, as well as his own sculpted artefacts, and used them in various ways within his actions from about 1963 onwards, and which came to form material residues of his oeuvre, long since scalped, curated, and exhibited in museums. Bedin, as an example of what might be called a non-declared category of event, certainly partook of the Fluxus disinterest in ostentatious avant-garde artistic competitiveness, though it displayed the antithesis of that network's avowed belief in anonymity, being centred on the charisma of those two counterculture gods. It combined, however, the emergent Lenono personality cult with many of the elements George McCunas had identified in 1965 as Fluxus-centric, the non-theatrical qualities of simple natural event, a game or a gag, unquote. Yoko had also been a contributor to that loose grouping of performers, including painters, dancers, actors, and musicians, whose activities in the early 60s constituted the happenings which were also categorised at the time and since as events, situations, sound theatre, and new music. This group interacted with Fluxus, and the two groups' memberships mutated throughout the period. Yoko's Bagged Place event from 1966, for instance, a four-room apartment in Vancouver, Canada, in which the artist encased every item in plastic bags, creating a monitored situation which lasted for 2 weeks, had introduced the Bedin elements of, one, an altered real socio-physical interior place, and two, sustained duration. Like Naumann's situations or installations, performance corridor, light taped video corridor, touch and sound walls, all from 1969, created during this conjuncture, Yoko was not concerned to make individual or grouped objects central to the viewer's attention to or experience of this place. And this attitude fundamentally differentiated most of her works from the concerns of, for instance, those artists beginning to be dubbed the minimalists and the literalists, although these terms engendered a range of both positive and negative connotations at the time, and the works they produced remained open to radically different interpretations. Like Naumann, Yoko's interest lay rather in human perceptions of movements and interactions within these constructed socio-spaces, the consciousness and self-consciousness of individuals placed in a situation of contact with the added element of more or less intrusive specular mediation of the event's duration through use of cameras, tape recorders, and distanced observers. Coming towards the end now. Conceptualism became the term perhaps most often applied to Yoko's work during the 60s and 70s, although they always contained and subtended objectified materials of one kind or another, if sometimes these amounted only to lines written on a bit of paper. Herbeler's work might equally be characterised as ushering in this phase of what I call austerity globalism in the visual arts. The commodity status of these materialised forms of works seems to have been less of an issue for Yoko than for Herbeler, though by the early 70s one faction of the conceptualist artist formation was particularly concerned explicitly to attempt to decommodify production and dissemination processes, seeing the dangers posed by the processes then beginning radically to integrate Western European and US contemporary art markets into globalizing capitalism. The incoherence, or seeming incoherence of Bedin does suggest an attitude of relative indifference to objects within the mise-en-scène of Suite 1742. But the event was anyway always already, and declaratively so, saturated in commodified labour of varying kinds. John's commercial radio commentaries, the contracted interviews and photo ops, the CBC filming and broadcast of the event, its overall management by record company executives and fixers, the hire and maintenance of the room itself, the recording of Give Peace a Chance and its later sale and marketing. The tenor of this form of indifference, then, was partly that of the super-rich largesse which Lenono's celebrity royalty status exuded, whilst they were aware all the time that the money would roll in anyway, perhaps for world peace as much as to line the pockets of the media corporations in tow. Like some of the events of Alan Caprow, Bedin had no definite script, but established a temporary context or world, was not manifestly object-centred, though many objects helped to create the situation, certainly did not try to present itself as a synthesis of the arts or as categorically an art phenomenon itself. Bedin dealt, when it dealt with anything manifestly or programmatically, rather with the matter of consciousness and attitudes, towards the war in Vietnam, towards peace as an ideal of totalized human relation, and towards social transformation as a utopic global theme. The global equals the total. It is unavoidably a metaphorizing conceit, spiraling away rapidly and perhaps uncontrollably from its apparent literal meanings, processes and references in the world, careering seamlessly from the objective to the subjective. The artistic ideal of the Gesamtkunstwerk, a totalized synthesis of all the arts, ending all boundaries and borders between them, rematerialized under a transformed meaning of architecture, signifying no more and no less than complete social societal structure, is another of its forms, and no less than our own notion, than is another of its forms, as was Beuys's own notion of social sculpture. Tatlin's model for the monument to the Third International remains the earlier, richly generative form underpinning my overall historical concerns, a utopic engine of references and ideals, themes and commitments, whose confusion of denotative and connotative elements excited but also worried his fellow revolutionary constructivists, many of whom saw it as metaphysically and spiritually bourgeois, as well as materialist and grounded in a supposedly pure earthed form of social transformation under the then yet to fully emerge Bolshevik leadership. Something of the ecstasy of this ideal is traceable in Caprow's 1958 essay, Notes on the Creation of a Total Art, worth bearing in mind when considering the peace duration dimensions to Bedin. Quote, this is Caprow, "In this present exhibition, we do not come to look at things. We simply enter, are surrounded, and become part of what surrounds us, passively or actively according to our talents for engagement. We ourselves are shaped, though we are not often conscious of that fact. We have different coloured clothing, can move, feel, speak, and observe others variously, and will constantly change the meaning of the work by so doing. What has been worked out is a form that is as open and fluid as the shapes of our everyday experience, but does not simply imitate them. I believe that this form places a much more greater responsibility on visitors than they have had before," unquote. Retrospective accounts of visitors to the shrine in Montreal confirm this honey-tinted experience, their sense of remembered transcendence and lightheadedness in the company of the celebrities' royalties for world peace, in a situation where the performance of ordinariness, the ordinariness of performance, appeared within the magic to eliminate, or at least reduce, coarse distinctions between art and everyday life. The rituals of the morning bed-making, the reading of the daily papers, John and Lennon in their pyjamas. Temporality and duration are highlighted and transformed in Bedin, this vacation with the dissident stars shared with millions through TV and radio within the electric space of countercultural utopic yearnings. The avant-garde group Pulsar, represented by artist Michael Caine in a March 1969 panel discussion in New York, called to aid the Student Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam, had similarly explored and created situations of sustained duration, quote, programming environments through electronic technology, unquote, in outdoor and interior spaces and in the countryside. Collective in organisation, Pulsar was concerned to sense time and space as socially and culturally produced entities within which human relation exists and reproduces itself. Their belief was that all human societies, both historically and in the present, secreted discontinuous temporal, spatial, time ecology worlds. But this recognition of inherent variety indicated Pulsar's own emergent global consciousness of heterogeneity. What then was the time of my lie as opposed to the time of Manhattan or Wall Street? How did one time ecology influence or dictate the fortunes of the other? Pulsar recognised too how the human environment, in New York anyway, was, quote, totally dominated by electronic phenomena. Our total environment, at least at night, is electric, unquote. Douglas Hurbler, taking part in the same discussion, commented that contemporary artists knew no more about space than they really did about time. Understanding of them was merely conventional, he observed, pragmatically obverting the problem that they were both actually boundless. Hurbler's photographs, he said, dealt in snippets of time and space and the problem of human consciousness of them. Incoherent as Bedin, these photographs, Hurbler said, were, quote, just a way of pulling something out of a series of possibilities and calling it a work, unquote. Ian Wilson, another artist on the panel, concluded time was, quote, just a vast illusion. It's just a never-ending illusion without any possible understanding of it, unquote. This electric illusion had real effects. This is at the crux of Debord's account of spectacle, creating the separations and integrations of capitalist society. Bedin partook of spectacle, was a creature of it, and yet wished utopically to oppose it, both for immediate and utopic reasons. The antinomy to this illusion was what Lenin had called imagination. Tragedy of Bedin's globalist idealism is that its necessary and proper form was that of spectacle and commodity consumption. It is the counterculture, culture industry's creature through and through, and most of these associated with it were always aware of that, although on a variety of levels. In 2009, on the 40th anniversary of Bedin, Yoko launched her new album of music and words. An exhibition of John's possessions took place in New York to accompany it, including display of the bloody glasses he'd worn when shot in 1980. Lenono's own drug of choice at Bedin had been chilled champagne, while their, quote, professionally rolled joints as smooth as cigarettes, wrapped in pastel-coloured papers, were offered round from a sterling silver cigarette case. In these ways, Bedin partook of and signalled the emerging global service economy in the luxury commodities sector that had begun at the same time to operate a grip on the high end of the contemporary art world, against which some artists, conceptualists, minimalists, and others undesignated, began to react, along with the stratum of critics and journals, particularly after the hitherto leftist Art Forum magazine started to capitulate to the design and advertising demands of the art market's globalizing political economy during the mid-1970s. But the peace message of Bedin wasn't cynical or issued in bad faith. Rather, it exposed, gave voice to, and would go on to proliferate the contradictions of this instance of utopian globalist idealism lodged within the technical apparatus of the West's diffuse spectacle. It was a message and a social movement within a range of broadly new left and centre-left formations, including anti-war, feminism, black rights activism, sexual preference politics, disabilities activism, environmentalism, anti-apartheid, post-colonial, third world, non-aligned movement, which had to negotiate its place within the social relations of capital and the different forms of state power dominant across the Western European, the US, and other advanced democratic capitalist nations in the world. The highly suggestive critical terms emergent in this moment of the later 1960s and early 70s, dematerialization, eccentric abstraction, anti-form, process art, anti-illusion, had, within the crisis conjuncture of Bedin, deeply political and ideological as well as aesthetic meanings. Fluxus activists and following conceptualists interacted, flowed into each other, as the broader groups later to be identified as performance artists also did with the conceptualists. None of these terms and the taxonomies they have spawned in the art historical literature are particularly helpful in making sense of the actual conjuncture in which these practices and movements engaged within the social process. In that process between 67 and 73, ideas and visual form were always inextricably linked. There was no border, no barricade or wall between them in the first place. What artists shared in that conjuncture was a desire, not to stop creating objects, but to think through the materialities of different forms of practice and their relations to the art market, the social order understood as a totality, and an expanded sense of the world and world times beyond national boundaries, as 1970s globalization processes ushered in our own condition of late capitalist postmodernity. Ironically post-industrial, sceptical of art market objectives and incipiently environmentally aware, the emergent mood might be exemplified by Costa's 1970, a piece that is essentially the same as a piece made by any of the first conceptual artists, dated 2 years earlier than the original and signed by somebody else. Unquote. Austerity globalism had arrived. The good and the bad times of bed-in were over. And I'm over. Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
Let's take 5 minutes to have a rest.
You speak about divorce, critique and spectacle, and politicized forms of conceptual art. And your Horn and John Lennon's bedding. In several points of your presentation, I was reminded of recent strategies, of a renewed sense of political critique through attempts at the détournement of structures and spectacle media. So, do you, what is your opinion of these contemporary relations, kind of nostalgic ones, attempts to revive that kind of spirit?
I hope it doesn't come across that the lecture is too pessimistic. I mean, I listen to myself, it often sounds very pessimistic, actually, as if there's...
Sorry, I was asking, in his kind of critique of the bedding piece by Jonathon and his references to Diderot's notions of the détournement and critiquing the spectacle of mass movement. Did he see any kind of nostalgic relations with events happening today, kind of critique of global capitalism and so on?
Yeah, I was just saying that I'm often aware that some of this can sound very pessimistic and also as if there's never any possibility of any real opposition, because everything's always going to be absorbed and reappropriated. But I don't believe that, and I think the bed-in at St Paul's at the moment is a kind of good example of how protest can still be important and significant and possibly make quite important, change or develop things towards change at least. That seems to me to be a low-tech event, though, and that might be quite interesting. Is that what I'm talking about is what culminates with Live Aid and bedding, Live Aid and Band Aid in the 80s. I was tempted at one point to call it from Ono to Bono, of course. I didn't want to go down that route. And you look at events like Live Aid or Band Aid and you say, yes, they were clearly good and had benefits, but in other ways they were clearly bad and were destructive. And they're both true. But I don't want to come across finally as pessimistic or unduly kind of cynical. But I have to admit, on the whole, I'm not very optimistic. And I think, I don't know, we may be reaching a point where, given the crisis in the Eurozone and beyond that, in global economies in the West at least, if not in Asia at the moment, other forms of activity not peaceable will start to occur more frequently and probably more destructively. So I mean, I am a bit pessimistic about what positive things can come out of the situation in broad terms. But you take events individually, don't you? You look at them and assess what immediate effect they might have. And then as time passes, they appear different, and you see them within different perspectives, don't you, as well? I'm looking at an event now which is deeply historical, actually, and trying to show how it relates to the present, but it comes from a moment in the past that is, you know, familiar to us in some ways, but quite different as well. So I wouldn't want to jump to any conclusions about contemporary art. That's what you mean. Have you got any particular example? Do you think about?
I was thinking of St. Paul's and the Wall Street, more in terms of that current kind of actions that kind of revive that romantic kind of belief in.
And particularly with the Christian aspect of the St. Paul's thing is actually quite interesting as well. Although John Lennon was pretty anti-Christian, and that was one element that doesn't come through embedding as any kind of interest in organised religion very well.
We can say as the production of the gender as well, the marriage between these two as a nation, as a political, between imperialism and capitalism, that when happened, merging between two totally different significance of imperialism, they always want to be inside, in war, not they always inside as fascism or what happened in Second War. So they're always in war, versus capitalism always go out to take the resources. But now these two merging in terms of political.
Well, we don't know. I think it's.
It does affect the static art, and it's a regime of political static.
Yeah, I mean, a good instance of another thing to look at would be what happened in Argentina after 2000. Andrea Giunta, a critic and historian who used to work in Buenos Aires, now in Texas actually.
She's moved on to paper again.
Moved on again, actually. She's written a very good essay in this book, I think, called Globalization and Contemporary Art, about what happens in Argentina after 2000, in a situation of very kind of serious social breakdown, and how artists responded to what was going on, and basically tried to just bypass the whole question of the market relations, basically. They were not, it was such an emergency that they weren't actually much bothered about trying to be making a living as artists. And that's obviously one question that feeds into these debates in some ways. But we might be getting to a point where things are so serious that everything, the social relations are transformed, and the market and questions of making a living have kind of become irrelevant for a period. Well, I don't know. What do people think here?
Yeah, but Argentina went bankrupt.
I know. Yeah.
Well, it's an extreme situation.
Yeah.
And also wanted to say, well, what positive sides do you see in St. Paul's there? I mean, what could be the positive outcomes of St. Paul's? Just to give us some.
Only to raise some pretty basic questions about capitalism at the moment in Europe and in Britain and the world beyond, and whether it can actually ever deliver decent quality of life for all people. Just those sorts of pretty basic.
So it brings discussions and talks
it's
awareness.
Yeah, it's partly successful because it's not pro anything, isn't it? It's an organisation anti-capitalist, which if it had been organised or seemed to be organised by a particular faction on the left, for instance, it could have been closed down much earlier, in fact. So I think tactically they're absolutely right to keep it as an anti-capitalist demonstration, and not to make too visible. This is where the spectacle comes in, and dealing with the media, not to make too visible the range of probably political groups that are involved with it, which presumably are mostly on the left. But of course there is right-wing anti-capitalism as well.
I saw a demonstration in New York just on the weekend with people with placards kind of marching around Wall Street. The placards read, "God against the bankers." It's like a clearly religious faction that were kind of joining in.
This is a positive sign.
Yeah. tactically, it's a very good move to base it around asking basic questions about Christianity, isn't it? And the BBC, I think, finds it particularly hard to deal with this. They really are sort of, in a way, caught out by it, because it can't be dismissed as a small river of left-wing Marxist, Marxists or something. But I would have thought the situation in Greece at the moment is pretty close to a kind of tipping point as well. We don't know what will happen, do we? But and people will respond to it in all kinds of ways, not just professionally, as it were, as artists or something. That's what's striking and kind of, as I say, poignant about Bedding was that it was emergency. What do you do in an emergency with what's going on in Vietnam in 1969? How do you mobilise against that in ways that might have some effect beyond, as we know here as well, very narrow representative democratic forms that don't bring change quickly? In an emergency, how do you act? And that's what I think made them think that was the right thing to do. Although I keep saying all the time, it's doomed at the same time because it's so much penetrated by all the forces that also govern how the industrial war economies work, basically.
We have other questions.
I liked very much the way that you dissected the notion of being embedded as a performance, and this idea of, I had never previously kind of thought really quite through just the simple act of the night dress and the pajamas and kind of theatrical costumes, and I think that was brought out quite nicely with the inclusion of the two versions album cover, and the thought of that kind of almost like Eric and Ernie in bed together sort of performative, theatrical, comedic element. And I liked the way that you focused in on drawing Debord in to critique this notion of the lifestyle of the rich and famous, the whole permanent vacation and the champagne and all of this. So I wondered, did you feel that they were in some way turning the concept of their celebrity status intentionally, or do you think that they were trying to have this quite radical performance, but at the same time still indulging in the sort of gloss of what was available to them as somewhat pampered celebrities? Do you think that was just kind of an accident?
I think it's, I'm a pretty big fan of the Beatles, I must say, and John Lennon, but I think it's hugely indulgent, basically. And overall, they were just intoxicated by their own egos and what they could do because of who they were.
And it's terribly ambiguous. I mean, it's quite an ambivalent performance. It straddles two worlds, and I'm not sure how successfully it works in either necessarily.
Yeah, and it's not a performance that's running, as I say in the lecture, it's not running in the same way at all the time. And if you read the accounts from some of the people who are involved producing it televisionally and stuff, they say things like, in fact, a lot of the time it was quite boring. Nothing much was happening. So what we get is kind of snippets of the exciting bits, really. But they hadn't really thought it through, I don't think. So a lot of what they did. That's what I'm saying, is that there was no particular organised intention behind it. And they had some ideas about what they were doing, and afterwards they construct, explanations of what they did. This is why I hope that those questions about how artists either can preconceive what they're doing or don't preconceive, and then afterwards could create all kinds of elaborate explanations for what they did. This is a common issue that we should all be interested in, I think, and think about. And it's no different from what they were up to, I think. Well, on the whole, I think they were just massively self-indulgent.
Speaking of boredom, didn't Duchamp define happenings as something that you went to be bored?
Yeah, I mean, there was a CBC documentary which you can get parts of. I've never actually seen the whole thing, and that is a kind of compressed, very short. But that's what I was saying about duration. That thing lasted a week, so it's going to be boiled down, isn't it, and presented in all the way that the media always does that.
But it works very well as a marketing stunt to draw attention. So I mean, it's not wholly unsuccessful as an activist strategy per se, but it's definitely quite complicated in terms of its values and resonance and success.
Well, that's the big question that the whole thing raises: is it might be successful, but it's at the cost of further entrenching spectacular technology and alienation, actually.
quite interestingly, at Versailles, the royal bedroom chamber had this little banister, because in the morning, King Louis would have his courtiers come and make presentations to him whilst he was still in bed.
Yeah.
And so I think there's an interesting connection between the bed in and...
I hadn't thought about that for your footnote.
Yeah.
Just show, yeah.
Well, I think the situation is complicated by two things. One is the fact that because of globalization, you know, the enemy is sort of, it's a ghost enemy and nobody knows where it is. The system is integrated. Whereas, you know, maybe 30 years ago, you might have identified a particular government supporting a capitalist.
Yeah.
At the moment, it's global.
Yeah.
You know, so even if the government changes in particular, you know, sovereign countries, the system will not change. Secondly, because of the sort of what I call the postmodern ethos, there is no authority that anyone believes in, and therefore it's impossible to focus in any kind of action. And therefore, we're left with groups of people just protecting themselves and reacting to their own personal situation rather than to any kind of ideals,
Yeah.
which is pretty hopeless and very sort of petty.
Yeah. And that's a pretty pessimistic account, isn't it? And I agree with it basically. It's fragmentation and it's falling apart really. It always ends up quite pessimistic in the end. These discussions are really a shame.
Well, I wouldn't say pessimistic. It's only very complex. So you gotta find the authorities or the people to fight, and certainly there are. I'm sure. I don't believe in full vision, honestly.
So there's nothing to focus that effort, because you know the idea of truth and that's so diversified at the moment with the postmodern attitude of people. As well as dissemination of information, media. I mean, look at, does anybody watch the same program? No. We don't even have any focused communication channels anyway. We're just sort of petty individuals, just doing our own.
There is a sense that we're living a kind of a collapse of a cycle in world political economic sense. And that no one really knows what will happen, but there is kind of profound change that is kind of possible at this particular moment. So in that sense, it's kind of, although it's impossible to understand exactly in a kind of a Marxist kind of Hegelian sense where the world is kind of leading to.
Yeah.
There is a kind of an acknowledgement that even in the most kind of reactionary sense, that there is a kind of necessity for change, and that change is kind of dawning upon us, whether we like it or not. So,
it's a very positive way of calling it change rather than destruction and chaos.
That's an opportunity for
it's like a guitar.
That's an opportunity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was thinking this is good to be positive about it, and I'm just imagining a discussion about the early 30s in terms of things are changing. We have to move on with the times. Yes, we have to act now. We're not dealing with the past. So yeah, we need to accentuate the positive sides to this. But I agree with everything you've said. There's that sense of complete kind of fragmentation, and the nation states are themselves. The states pretend they know what they're doing, don't they? And it's all the whole business about the euro and stuff is about the elites trying to manufacture the idea that they still have control over this process. And we know they don't. It's blindingly obvious. But so you go from very kind of absolutely sharp empirical issues like the eurozone or whatever to the broader philosophical kinds of questions. And the leap is very big, isn't it? I mean, it's to postmodernism at the end of the master narrative and all that sort of thing. I mean, it's hard to know how to make sense of such events that are both have their own kind of immediate qualities and significance, and how they fit into the broader pictures. And that's changed as well. Like, that sense of context has changed because of globalization as well. But if you then say it's an unprecedented situation, you sound a bit again, you're disabling people in a way by saying we can't make sense. You had to try and make sense, but you're right, there is no theoretical perspective, there's no author, no historical tradition that can understand the situation we're in. Not Marx or Devore or David Harvey or anyone at all. I think it seems to be beyond all of our understandings that we've had from previous generations.
Yeah, but you gotta say that this is the role of the intellectuals or thinkers to get answers, possible answers, or visions or perspectives of problem the way you like. That's our job.
Maybe to articulate doubt in a positive way.
For example, well, if you think that it is effective, then go for a positive way. Otherwise, not. I think it's effective.
Anyway, on that quasi-optimistic note,
Sort of a manufacturer
thank
at
you very
this
much,
point.
Jonathan, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming, yeah.
Remind you that in a fortnight time, I think it's the 16th of November, we'll have Salif Bookman, who's an academic editor from Vienna, Austria. He's going to be speaking about gendered architectures in languages. Thank you very much.
Thank you.